And so when we have conversations with people about veganism, I guess the imperative isn't to offload lots of information onto them, because information can be heavy and sometimes isn't always productive. I view these conversations as more being a way or a manner in which we can spark just a thought in someone's head to make them question themselves. And that's what's really wonderful about the Socratic method, is because the onus is on you asking questions, always asking questions. It allows the person you're speaking to understand themselves better and understand how they feel better. I fundamentally believe that veganism it's not something you have to give someone, right? Like the morals and philosophy of veganism isn't something that someone has to be given, but it's something they just have to rediscover in themselves. You know, we all hate animal cruelty. I've never met anyone that enjoys animal cruelty. Even people that commit acts of cruelty to animals. I've never met anyone that actually relishes in that. I mean, of course, people do exist like that, unfortunately, but the vast majority of people are staunchly against animal cruelty. And also staunchly against the destruction of our environment, coincidentally, right? Surprise, surprise. And so that's the foundation, isn't it? Being against the suffering of non-human animals, and of course humans as well. And so if that's the values that we preach and we live by, or we should live by, then actually veganism isn't something new to someone. It's about rediscovering what they already know within themselves. And that's why asking questions is so fundamental and so powerful, because it allows someone to understand themselves better. The thing is, we're raised in cultures and in families where values and beliefs and moral systems are dictated to us. And we don't really actually scrutinize or think through how we feel. We just merely adopt what we've always done and what we're told is normal within the context of the cultures that we're raised in, which is really dangerous when you think about it, because cultural practices and traditional practices are sometimes incredibly oppressive and horrendously archaic and transgressive. You know, a lot of the progress we've made as a society is because we challenged preconceived norms and values. And so veganism is exactly that. It's challenging preconceived norms. But we've never scrutinized that within ourselves, which is why most of us live in this state of hypocrisy or cognitive dissonance, right? We're justifying something that goes against how we feel and what we preach. Cognitive dissonance, really powerful psychological concept. But the Socratic method is a great way of getting through that, because people can understand themselves better. And I see when we have these conversations, it's almost like we're being that voice in someone's head. You know, that kind of nagging voice we get that's always trying to like trip us up, and when we're scrutinizing and it's like asking us difficult questions, and sometimes we just want to ignore it. Well, I see us as being the facilitator of that annoying little voice that you sometimes get in your head that won't shut up asking you difficult questions, making you feel uncomfortable. Like, I think we probably all had that when we were on our way to veganism, that bit where we kind of knew we should do it, right, but we kind of didn't want to, but we just couldn't stop thinking about it, and no matter what we said to ourselves, that voice was still there telling us we should do it. I had that where I was just like, I really don't want to do it, but this voice was like, well, you know, you've got to, you know, and I was like, but oh, come on, and it was like, no, I'm going to stay here until you change. So I think that's what we are, that voice. And so when people ask us stuff, they never have to justify it. And so what I mean by that is people will say, well, you know, I don't want to be vegan. Okay, well, why? Why? And then they have to say something, well, you know, other animals eat other animals. And they go, well, why does that make a difference? And I think that this simple word why is so wonderful, because it really encourages people to actually think about the arguments that they're making. People just use arguments all the time without ever having to actually rationalize it or explain the argument that they're using. And so it's almost like that kind of petulant child, you know, like, oh, he's always asking the parent, why? And then the parent's just like, for goodness sake, I don't know, okay, just because. Right? And that's that thing we are. We're like a petulant child who just wants to keep, why? But why? But why does this make a difference? You know, why does the fact that, you know, we've always done this make a difference? That why encourages people to think deeper and deeper and deeper, because the deeper they go, the more illogical they actually become. And so this asking questions is a wonderful form of just encouraging people to understand themselves and then getting to know their moral code. I guess deeper than it actually is. 5, all right then. Deeper than it actually is. And so if we apply that in like a practical sense, what does that look like? Because what I think about before we were vegan, I think like most of us probably were encouraged by documentaries, maybe videos online, maybe studies, but I think it wasn't like an overload of information that got us there. I think often it's the subtleties in what we hear or what we see that encourage us to change. Just the most obvious stuff, not the complexities of science that encourages us. It's sometimes the most basic stuff. And so people will often justify things by saying, well, you know, humane slaughter is a great example, right? Well, you know, I think it's okay to kill an animal if it's done in a humane way. And so we could say, well, you know, that's not true because no, an animal doesn't have to die, and I think it's cruel then to do that. But maybe a more effective thing to say would be like, well, what does humane mean to you? Because again, we use these terms and these words, and we use them so broadly, and we have to get people to define what they mean by these words. So ask, well, what does the word humane mean to you? And then they'll probably say something like, oh, you know, killing the animal without pain or something. And you say, well, what about like an objective form, like an objective definition? You know, what would the synonyms be? What would, you know, if we opened a thesaurus and we looked for the word humane, what other words would be there alongside it? Okay, well, compassion, benevolence are of course in there. And you go, okay, well then, you know, can we kill an animal in a compassionate or benevolent way if they don't have to die and if they don't want to die? I don't think anyone could say that we could do that compassionately. And you go, well, if it can't be compassionate, can it be humane? And it's this kind of like cycle of questioning that hopefully you get someone to be like, well, no. But then they've realized that within themselves. And what I really like about this is people can't get angry at you then, right? Because you're merely asking them and they're answering how they feel. Well, they can't get angry at you because they've expressed how they feel. And I think a lot of the time that anger and frustration people feel at vegans is when they feel like they're being judged, firstly. And also when they feel like they're being told what to do. And they're being told that they're bad people or told that they're living in an immoral way. But the beauty of asking someone questions is we never actually tell them how we feel. Now, of course, in some conversations, we're going to express ourselves a little bit. And it's okay to say something that's a little bit more factual based or fact-based. But as asking as many questions as possible, it leads people to get into their conclusion in a way that they don't feel judged in doing so because it's just something they've learned within themselves. And another example you could say is, you know, are you against animal cruelty? You know, everyone's going to say, of course I'm against animal cruelty. Okay, well, we'll define what cruelty means. You know, I think most people will say, well, you know, it's inflicting harm unnecessarily. You know, that word unnecessarily is important. And you go, well, is it necessary for us to kill animals in slaughterhouses and eat them? I think we can all agree that it isn't. Most people will say no. Some people might say, yeah, protein or iron. And then you say, well, can you get protein from plants? And nearly everyone's going to say yes. And you go, well, if it's not a necessity then surely to take the life of an animal for food is unnecessary, as you've stipulated, which therefore in your vision of the word cruelty means that it is an act of cruelty, which means that you're against animal cruelty, but by your own admission, you perpetuate systems that you define as being cruel to animals. And that's obviously some people are, oh yeah, of course, right, because that's my definition of cruelty, and you've just applied that back to me. I think I like that. I really like that. But it's not just about language, of course, because the Socratic dialogue is about asking questions, but it's also about body language. And I think confidence is really important when we talk to people. Not being overly confident and cocky, but having a form of confidence where we feel like we grasp what we're talking about. And so what I mean by that is how we perceive ourselves, how we open ourselves up. And so if we're really closed off and we're like, you know, got our hands clenched, you know, that's a very aggressive sign of body language, right? And it creates like a lot of friction. So we need to make sure that we're kind of open. You know, and if we open our arms up, it suggests vulnerability and trust. And I think that's really important as well because the person we're speaking to has to have an element of trust with us. Language is important. I used to use lots of accusatory language. I also have a problem where when I start to get angry, my finger comes out and I start pointing. Right? This is like my one thing. Like you can see it in some videos. I start to get rattled, right? And then this finger starts, and I've got to like just curl it back in again, right? So maybe we all have these little behaviors that we do that suggest we're a bit on edge. Mine's the finger. So be careful with things like that, but also be careful with language. I used to use a lot of like yous. You're doing this, it's your fault, you know, you're killing animals, you. But actually, if we use words like we and our rather than you and your, it creates a sense of, you know, not isolation and not blaming, but a sense of collective responsibility. Now, of course, we're holding the individual responsible, but there's also a collective liability. And so, I wasn't born vegan. I'm sure most of us weren't. If you were, that's wonderful. But most of us probably weren't. And so at some point we were involved in those systems of violence and we were, you know, perpetuating what was happening to the animals. And using we and our is kind of like a humbling way of accepting that responsibility, but also showing that there isn't this tension, you know, this isn't this friction. It's not, we're not accusing you, even though it is them doing it. It's not just their fault. There's a whole mechanism in place that's led up to this point. So, you know, when we buy animal products, we're responsible for what happens to animals in slaughterhouses. You know, we have a responsibility to look at our actions It is our fault what's happening to the planet and the animals, you know, not you and not your. I think that definitely goes a long way. And I think with that body language aspect, keeping somewhat calm is definitely fundamental to that. Now, if someone's being, you know, slightly cheeky with you or slightly passive aggressive, it's okay to meet them a little bit, right? You don't have to get, you know, stay like meek and ultimately calm. You can press yourself a little bit, but I think the general rule of thumb is to seem just very relaxed and be calm as much as we possibly can. And sometimes we're going to get angry, sometimes we're going to get overly emotional, sometimes we might not feel confident and comfortable, and we might leave a conversation feeling frustrated. But that's okay, right? Like we're not always going to be right, we're not always going to get it perfect, but we can just keep learning and keep striving and keep going. And so, Socratic method. Ask questions, lots and lots of questions. Help people understand how they actually feel, why they feel this way. Make people rationalize and analyze their actions like they've never done before because they haven't. And give people the benefit of the doubt, because people aren't bad because they do bad things, you know. Someone isn't wholly a bad person because they buy animal products or they hunt. Good and bad is so hard to define, and good people do bad things and bad people do good things. And so we can't categorize someone as being wholly bad because they do bad things, right? I think that's really important. Remember that we used to be this person. I used to use the free range argument all the time. I used to laugh and say bacon. I used to be that person, right? Now I'm not, because I changed and I learned. So remember that people, they're not bad people. We used to be like them. And also remember that there's a whole system that has created these mindsets in people. You know, when someone walks past footage of pigs being killed and they shot bacon, right? It's a terrible thing that they've done, but there's a whole system behind them that's pushed them to that point. And so that could be social pressure, you know, the expectation of eating meat to be masculine or showing little empathy to be masculine, that social stigma that they feel like they have. They're with their friends, they want to perpetuate that and make themselves seem manly. Maybe they're actually upset by what they see and they don't want to admit that because that would seem weak in their eyes, and so they overcompensate by trying to make it funny. Okay, there's that. There's also that cultural aspect. This is where they've been raised. There's also that family aspect of how they're raised. Maybe their families used to laugh at people. So I think we have to see past the excuses that people use and try and understand. And it's like if you do like debating masterclasses or like workshops in university or whatever, often one of the things they'll get you to do is debate the opposite of how you feel. Like debate the opposite to what you believe. And that's a really uncomfortable thing, because we don't want to debate in favor of killing animals or exploiting animals. But that's actually a really powerful thing to do, because by doing that, we learn their arguments better. We can also empathize with their arguments better, not to agree with them, but to understand them. And then through understanding them, we can respond better. And we can also stay more calm because we get the process. And often these processes are on the surface very logical. You know, that whole like, what would we do with all the animals if we went vegan? That's actually really, really logical when you think about it. Like, you know, if you've never explored the idea, well, what would we do with the animals? Logical on the surface, but illogical when you think about the practicalities of it. And I think that's what a lot of these excuses are. They seem logical on the surface to the people saying them, but they just need to be given that backstory, that, you know, the reasoning why it's not logical and is nonsensical. And anyway, okay, I've talked for a while. I've said lots of different things. The time is gone. I ignored it apparently, just like 1 minute. I think people often, when they feel guilty, is when they say the most hurtful things, because they want to distance themselves from the guilt as much as possible. So I think that's what happens to a lot of people, is they say that, and the reason they're saying that is because they know it's hurtful, and they know that it's probably one of the most upsetting things they can say is, well, I love how it tastes. But I think actually that one is an interesting one, because a response would be, well, do you think that the taste or the enjoyment of something justifies what happens, right? You know, oh, I like how meat tastes too much to give it up. Oh, well, do you think that enjoyment of it is a good enough reason to justify what happens to animals, you know? Most people will be like, no. Some people say yes, right? And if they say yes, you just say, well, what you're actually saying, therefore, is that sensory pleasure justifies what we do to others, right? That's the moral justification you're making, sensory pleasure. Taste is a sense. I find it enjoyable, sensory pleasure. And that really, I think, psychologically, that belittles the argument a lot, right? Sensory, because it makes it seem so trivial, which it is. But also you say, well, if you're using sensory pleasure as an argument, then you have to apply that to other scenarios. Like, it has to be applied somewhat, you know, ubiquitously to, you know, to other environments. You know, do you say, well, does sensory pleasure morally justify an action? Most people are going to say no. If they say no, you go, well, therefore taste isn't a good justification. If they say yes, you go, well, okay, can you name some other examples where an oppressor feels sensory pleasure at the expense of a victim? Right? We can all think of them. Get them to say what they are. And then you say, well, is that justified because of sensory pleasure? No, of course not. Okay, so then the sensory pleasure and the justification. But just say, does the enjoyment of something justify the consequences of it? You know? I think unless you've either got sociopathic friends or you've got disingenuous friends, right? Sociopathic's a problem, right? But disingenuous isn't a problem. You know, people will lie and be disingenuous all the time to justify something. And so even if they say yes, it does, they're lying. You know, they are, and you just need to get them to. But that again. Sometimes people are going to say something we don't want to hear. Sometimes people are going to get angry. Sometimes people are going to try and belittle us, blah, blah, blah. But they're thinking about it, right? And that's the important thing, you know? And even if someone says that thing to you, oh, I enjoy the taste of it too much, it's come from a place where they're having to think about it. So it's a good thing, you know? Because you've raised the point, or you've had a vegan option, or you've said, oh, look, there's this new vegan product in Albert Heijn, whatever. And they've said that, but they've said that for a reason, and that's because they've had a thought, and they're probably trying to suppress that thought. So it's all good. It's all good. Mostly. It doesn't feel like it, but it can be. But just ask them, you know, does the enjoyment of something justify what happens? And then if it does, sensory pleasure is the justification they're making, which you can't end up actually agreeing with. Yeah. If you take it further and further. Yeah. It's a good question.